What if the most meticulous record keeper in the entire Nazi regime had written it all down? Every meeting, every order, every inspection, every cold calculation and bureaucratic directive that sent millions to their deaths, documented in his own hand, in his own words, in the private journals and appointment diaries of Heinrich Himmler, the man who built and commanded the most murderous apparatus in the history of the modern world. For decades after the war ended, historians and prosecutors knew that Himmler had been a compulsive note-taker, a man who prided himself on precision and order, who recorded his daily schedule with the same systematic zeal he brought to the running of the SS. But the full picture of those journals, where they went, what they contained and what they revealed, remained one of the great unsolved mysteries of the post-war era. Some pages surfaced at Nuremberg, others were thought destroyed, and then, in a series of extraordinary archival discoveries, stretching from the 1970s all the way into the 21st century, the journals began to resurface. In archives in Moscow, in private collections, in the vaults of institutions that hadn't fully catalogued their holdings, the pages of Heinrich Himmler's inner world came back to light. In this video, we are going to go inside those journals to understand what Himmler wrote, what he planned, what he observed, and what his own words reveal about the man who was, in many ways, the true architect of the Holocaust. So, without further ado, let's begin. Heinrich Himmler was born on October 7, 1900, in Munich, Bavaria, the second of three sons in a deeply conservative, devoutly Catholic household. His father, Gebhard Himmler, was a school teacher of considerable social ambition, who had once served as a private tutor to the Bavarian royal family, a fact that Heinrich would return to again and again in his private writings, treating his father's proximity to royalty as a kind of inherited distinction. From his earliest diary entries, which he began keeping as a teenager, it is clear that young Heinrich Himmler was a young man preoccupied with self-improvement, social standing, and the cultivation of a personal identity that felt, to him, perpetually fragile. His early teenage journals, which survive in partial form and have been studied by historians including Peter Longerich, reveal a shy, bookish, physically insecure boy who compensated for his social awkwardness with extraordinary industriousness. He catalogued the books he read, the meals he ate, the people he met, and the hours he slept. He evaluated his own performance in school, in sports, in social interactions, with a self-critical precision that bordered on the obsessive. Even as a boy, Himmler was building a system for himself, a ledger of the self, an administrative record of his own existence. It was a habit that would never leave him. During World War I, Himmler was too young to see active combat, though he trained as an officer cadet and was devastated when the armistice of November 1918 came before he could reach the front. His journals from this period are full of frustrated patriotism and a burning sense that he had been denied the chance to prove himself. He writes of his humiliation, of Germany's betrayal, of the stab-in-the-back mythology that was already circulating in nationalist circles, and of his determination to find another way to serve the fatherland. After the war, Himmler studied agriculture at the Munich Technical University, graduating in 1922 with a degree in agronomy. He had wanted to be a farmer, to work the German soil, to embody the Völkisch ideal of the rooted German peasant that he had absorbed from nationalist literature. His journals from his university years show a young man ravenously reading through works of racial pseudoscience, German mythology, occult history, and far-right political theory. He was particularly drawn to the writings of racial theorists like Hans F. K. Günther and to the emerging ideas of the National Socialist movement, which he encountered through figures like Ernst Röhm and eventually Adolf Hitler himself. He attended one of Hitler's early speeches in Munich in 1922 and wrote about it in his diary with unmistakable excitement, describing Hitler as a man who spoke the truths that Germany needed to hear. He joined the Nazi Party that same year at the age of 22. From that moment forward, his entire life would be in service to an ideology that he had absorbed almost as a religious conversion. What made Himmler's journals so historically extraordinary and so chilling was not merely the fact that they existed, but the way in which they documented the intersection of the mundane and the monstrous. Himmler was, above all things, an administrator. His appointment books, known in German as Terminkalender, recorded his daily schedule in meticulous detail, the time of each meeting, the names of those present, the locations of inspections, the phone calls placed and received. These were not, in the traditional sense, introspective journals filled with emotional reflection. They were operational records, the working documents of a man who managed, at the height of his power, an empire within an empire. The SS, the Gestapo, the SD intelligence service, the concentration camp system, the Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units, the racial resettlement programs, the slave labor networks, all of it flowed through Himmler's office, and all of it left traces in his appointment books. When historians finally gained access to the most complete surviving set of these books, the volumes covering the years 1938 through 1944, discovered in Soviet archives in the early 1990s, they were confronted with something genuinely unprecedented. A day-by-day record in the perpetrator's own hand of the administrative machinery of genocide. The story of how Himmler's journals ended up scattered across multiple countries and archives is itself a remarkable tale of wartime chaos, deliberate concealment, and archival serendipity. As the war turned against Germany in 1944 and 1945, Himmler and his staff worked frantically to destroy as many incriminating documents as possible. Entire filing cabinets were burned, truckloads of records were destroyed, and key documents were either hidden or personally carried out of Germany by SS officers fleeing westward. Yet the sheer volume of paperwork generated by Himmler's bureaucratic empire made total destruction impossible. Some documents were captured by American forces advancing into Germany. Others were seized by the Soviets, who swept through Berlin and the surrounding areas in the spring of 1945 and gathered enormous quantities of Nazi documents, many of which were transported to Moscow and deposited in what became the Special Archive, a vast collection of captured foreign documents that Soviet authorities kept, largely secret for decades. It was from this Special Archive that Himmler's appointment diaries for the period 1938 to 1944 were eventually recovered, when German and international historians gained access to Soviet archives following the collapse of the USSR. Additional fragments of Himmler's personal correspondence and private notes surfaced in other locations, in the National Archives of the United States, in the German Federal Archives in Koblenz and Berlin, in private collections held by families of former SS officers, and in a particularly dramatic case in 2016 when a substantial cache of previously unknown Himmler documents was discovered in Israel, having been held by the family of a former Israeli intelligence official who had obtained them in the years after the war. To understand what the journals reveal, it is essential first to understand the man who wrote them. Heinrich Himmler rose through the ranks of the Nazi movement with extraordinary efficiency and almost no charisma. Unlike Hitler, who mesmerized crowds with his oratory, or Goebbels, who dazzled with his sharp intellect and gift for propaganda, or Göring, who exuded the swaggering confidence of a decorated war hero, Himmler was intensely ordinary in his personal presentation. He was short, soft-spoken, wore round, wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him the look of a provincial schoolteacher, and spoke in a dry, precise, bureaucratic style that could make even the most horrifying subjects sound like matters of routine administration. He was deeply uncomfortable in large social gatherings, preferred one-on-one meetings, and was known for his almost pathological politeness, a quality that many who met him found more unsettling than any display of overt aggression. His personal physician, Felix Kirsten, who treated Himmler for debilitating stomach cramps throughout the war and left detailed memoirs of their conversations, described a man who could discuss the most terrible things in a tone of calm, almost academic detachment, as if the mass murder of human beings was simply a management problem to be efficiently solved. And this, it turns out, is precisely what the journals confirm. The appointment diaries that survived from 1938 onward show a man whose schedule was overwhelming in its scope and relentless in its pace. On any given day, Himmler might meet with concentration camp commandants in the morning, confer with racial resettlement officials at lunch, receive reports from the Gestapo in the afternoon, take a phone call from Hitler in the early evening, and spend the last hours of the day reviewing agricultural data from the SS-managed farms that he believed would form the backbone of the future Germanic Empire in the East. His interests were extraordinarily wide-ranging, too wide-ranging, some of his subordinates privately believed, for any single man to manage effectively. He was personally involved in the details of SS uniforms, the design of SS runes, the management of SS archaeological expeditions, the curriculum of SS schools, the regulations governing SS marriage, and the racial vetting of SS families going back multiple generations. He maintained a personal file on each senior SS officer, annotated with his own observations and assessments. He was interested in herbal medicine, in alternative agriculture, in astrology, in the supposed historical authenticity of Aryan mythology. And all of this, the monumental and the trivial, the genocidal and the agricultural, appeared side by side in his appointment books, creating a portrait of a mind that could simultaneously plan mass murder and worry about the proper cultivation of caraway seeds. One of the most important things the journals reveal is the timeline and character of Himmler's personal knowledge of and involvement in the Holocaust. For decades after the war, a debate persisted among historians about exactly when and how the decision was made to murder all of Europe's Jews, and about how much various Nazi leaders actually knew about what was happening. Himmler's appointment books help answer these questions with devastating clarity. The entries for the summer and autumn of 1941, the period immediately following the German invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, show Himmler's schedule filling up with visits to the Eastern Territories, meetings with the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units, and consultations with senior SS and police officials involved in what the Nazi documents euphemistically called special treatment, the organized murder of Jews, communists and others deemed enemies of the Reich. The entries are terse and administrative, but their meaning is unmistakable. On August 15, 1941, Himmler personally witnessed the mass shooting of approximately 100 Jews near Minsk, an event that is documented both in his appointment diary and in separate accounts from other witnesses. He was reportedly disturbed by the spectacle of the shooting itself, troubled by its inefficiency and its psychological effect on the shooters. This discomfort did not lead him to question the policy. It led him to begin the search for a more systematic and psychologically less damaging method of mass murder. The appointment books from the months that followed show a flurry of meetings with technical experts, camp administrators and chemists, the bureaucratic process that would lead to the development and deployment of the gas chambers. The journals also shed remarkable light on Himmler's relationship with Adolf Hitler, a relationship that was in many ways the central personal dynamic of his adult life. From the earliest surviving diary entries that touch on Hitler, written in the early 1920s, it is clear that Himmler regarded Hitler with something approaching religious devotion. He did not simply admire Hitler as a political leader, he worshipped him as a man of destiny, a providential figure whose genius had been sent to rescue Germany from its enemies. This conviction never truly left Himmler, even as the relationship between the two men evolved into something considerably more complex. By the late 1930s, Himmler had become one of the most powerful figures in the Third Reich, a man whose SS empire touched virtually every aspect of German life, and yet his manner in his encounters with Hitler remained, according to every available account, almost servile. He sought Hitler's approval constantly, reported to him eagerly, and was visibly wounded by any sign of Hitler's displeasure. His appointment diaries from the years 1939 through 1944 record dozens of meetings with Hitler at the Führerhauptquartier, the various military headquarters complexes from which Hitler directed the war, and the entries, though brief, convey a picture of a man who organized his entire schedule around the possibility of a summons from the Führer. When Hitler called, Himmler came. When Hitler praised him, he glowed. When Hitler criticized him, he brooded. The journals from the early war years, 1939 through 1941, capture Himmler at the height of his institutional power and personal confidence. Germany's stunning military successes in Poland, France, and the Low Countries had vindicated, in his view, the ideology he had spent his adult life promoting. The conquest of Poland in September 1939 opened vast new territories for the racial reorganization programs he had long dreamed of. The expulsion of Poles and Jews from the annexed territories, the importation of ethnic Germans to replace them, the creation of a racially pure Germanic heartland in the East. His appointment diaries from the autumn and winter of 1939 are filled with meetings related to these population transfers, with officials from the Reichskommissariat for the Strengthening of Germandom, the agency he headed that coordinated the racial resettlement programs, with SD intelligence officers monitoring conditions in occupied Poland, with concentration camp administrators preparing to receive new categories of prisoners. These entries reveal a man who was not simply carrying out orders from above, but was actively driving policy, pushing for more radical and comprehensive measures, and chafing against the bureaucratic obstacles that sometimes slowed the implementation of his vision. One of the more striking aspects of the journals from this period is what they reveal about Himmler's relationship with the ordinary human beings whose lives and deaths he was administering. In his private correspondence, letters to his wife Marga, to his mistress Hedwig Potthast, to close associates within the SS, Himmler occasionally allowed himself moments of self-revelation that the appointment diaries, with their dry administrative format, did not accommodate. These letters, many of which have been preserved in German and American archives, show a man who was, in his personal relationships, capable of warmth, tenderness, and genuine emotional engagement. He wrote to his wife about their daughter Gudrun with evident paternal pride and affection. He worried about Marga's health, about the running of their household, about the education of their adopted son, Gerhard. He sent gifts, asked after friends, expressed concern for relatives serving at the front. And then, in the very next breath or the very next letter, he would write calmly about the administrative challenges of managing the concentration camp system or the logistical difficulties of moving tens of thousands of people from one part of occupied Europe to another. The coexistence of these two registers, the tender family man and the cold architect of mass murder, is one of the most disturbing aspects of the documentary record he left behind. It refuses the comfortable idea that the men who perpetrated the Holocaust were simply monsters, incomprehensible and alien. Himmler's journals remind us that the most dangerous thing about him was precisely how human he was in so many respects. The year 1941 represented a decisive turning point, and the journals reflect this with stark clarity. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, which began on June 22, 1941, was from Himmler's perspective not primarily a military operation, but a racial and ideological war of annihilation. He had been present at the planning stages of Barbarossa and had played a central role in designing the criminal orders that accompanied it. The Kommissar Order, which mandated the immediate execution of captured Soviet political officers, and the guidelines for the Einsatzgruppen, the SS and police mobile units that would follow the advancing German armies and murder Jews, communists, and other designated enemies. His appointment diaries from June through December 1941 document a frenetic period of travel and meetings as he worked to oversee the implementation of these policies. In the field, he visited the Eastern Territories multiple times, inspecting SS and police units, touring newly established prisoner-of-war camps where Soviet prisoners were dying by the hundreds of thousands from starvation and exposure, meeting with local commanders to press for more systematic and thorough operations. The entries are businesslike and emotionally flat, but they place Himmler at the center of decisions that resulted in the deaths of millions of people. The Minsk massacre of August 15, 1941, deserves particular attention because it is documented in such detail and because of what it reveals about Himmler's response to the physical reality of mass murder. The event is referenced in his appointment diary, and it is described at length in separate accounts from Walter Bruns, a Wehrmacht officer who witnessed it, and from Karl Wolff, Himmler's personal adjutant who accompanied him on the visit. According to these accounts, Himmler stood at the edge of the execution site and watched as SS men shot into a pit of Jewish men, women and children. He was visibly shaken, pale, swaying, almost losing his composure when the brains of one of the victims splattered onto his coat. It was a rare crack in the facade of bureaucratic composure that he normally maintained. In the days that followed, as documented in his appointment diaries, he held a series of meetings with SS and police commanders in which he explicitly raised the question of the psychological burden placed on the executioners. He was not troubled by the morality of what was being done, he was troubled by its method. He spoke of the need to find ways of sparing his men from the burden of direct shooting. His appointment book for the weeks after Minsk shows him meeting with camp administrators and technical officials, the conversations that would eventually lead to the systematic use of gas vans and, subsequently, the fixed extermination facilities at Chelmno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, Majdanek and Auschwitz-Birkenau. The road from Minsk to the gas chambers ran through Himmler's appointment diary. The journals from 1942 are among the most historically significant documents in the entire archive of Nazi-era records, because they cover the period in which the Holocaust was systematized and industrialized on a scale that the world had never seen before. By January 1942, when senior Nazi officials met at the Wannsee Villa outside Berlin to coordinate the implementation of what they called the final solution to the Jewish question, the mass murder of Jews was already well underway in the Soviet territories. The Wannsee Conference, which Himmler's subordinate Reinhard Heydrich chaired, was not a decision-making meeting, the decision had already been made, but a coordination meeting, designed to ensure that all the relevant agencies of the Nazi state were aligned in their efforts to murder every Jew in German-controlled Europe. Himmler's appointment diary for the weeks surrounding Wannsee shows him receiving reports from Heydrich, meeting with senior SS officers involved in the deportation programs, and coordinating with railway officials whose cooperation was essential for moving Jews from across Europe to the killing centres in the east. The entries are brief: meeting with Heydrich 1400, call from Globonik. But they place Himmler at the operational heart of what was unfolding. He was not a passive recipient of reports. He was the driving force, the man who pressed for acceleration, who demanded that deportations proceed faster, who ordered the expansion of killing capacity at Auschwitz when the existing facilities proved insufficient for the scale of murder he envisioned. Himmler visited Auschwitz on July 17th and 18th, 1942. A two-day inspection that is documented in his appointment diary and described in detail by Rudolf Höss, the camp commandant, in his post-war memoirs and interrogation testimony. It was during this visit that Himmler personally observed a gassing operation. A transport of Jews from the Netherlands had arrived at the camp, and Himmler watched as they were selected on the ramp. The healthy separated for slave labour, the others sent directly to the gas chambers, and then witnessed the actual gassing process. Höss later wrote that Himmler observed everything with calm, careful attention, asking questions, making notes, saying nothing that betrayed any emotional reaction. At the conclusion of the visit, Himmler promoted Höss and ordered him to expand the camp's killing capacity. His appointment diary for the days that followed shows a return to Berlin and an immediate resumption of his ordinary schedule: meetings with agricultural officials, an inspection of SS training facilities, a conference on racial resettlement policy. The visit to Auschwitz left no visible trace in his outward demeanour or his working routine. It was for him simply part of the job, the personal. Correspondence from 1942 offers a counterpoint to the cold efficiency of the appointment diaries. Himmler was in the midst of an intensifying relationship with his mistress, Hedwig Potthast, a former secretary 20 years his junior who would bear him 2 children during the war. His letters to Hedwig, many of which survived the war in private hands and were later acquired by German archives, reveal a side of Himmler that the official record entirely conceals: sentimental, almost adolescent in his expressions of affection, deeply invested in the fantasy of a private life far removed from the demands of his public role. He wrote to her about his love for music, about walks in the countryside, about his dream of one day retiring from public life to a quiet existence on a farm. He described the war's demands on him with something approaching self-pity: the sleepless nights, the endless responsibilities, the physical toll of constant travel. He never, in any surviving letter to Hedwig or to his wife Marga, described the nature of the work he was actually doing. The genocide was simply never mentioned. It existed in an entirely separate compartment of his consciousness, sealed off from the world of personal feeling that his letters inhabited. By 1943, the strategic situation had shifted dramatically against Germany, and Himmler's journals reflect both the mounting pressure and his response to it. The German defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, the loss of an entire army, more than 300,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, was a shock that reverberated through the entire Nazi state. Himmler's appointment diaries from the weeks after Stalingrad show a man who responded to catastrophe in his characteristic way, by working harder, by expanding the scope of his personal authority, and by doubling down on the ideological mission that he believed justified everything. He gave a series of speeches to senior SS officers and Nazi Party officials in 1943 that would later become among the most notorious documents of the entire Nazi era. The most famous of these, delivered on October 4, 1943 in Poznan to an audience of senior SS officers, was secretly recorded, and the recording survived the war. In it, Himmler spoke with extraordinary candour about what the SS had done and was doing. He acknowledged directly that the SS was murdering the Jewish people, men, women and children, and described it as a difficult duty that had to be performed for the sake of Germany's future. He told his audience that they would carry this secret to their graves, that it would never be written in history books, that it was a page of glory in German history that could never be spoken aloud. The discovery of this speech, and the recording that proved it had been delivered exactly as transcribed became one of the most damning pieces of evidence against the Nazi leadership and against the credibility of any claim by senior officials that they had not known about the Holocaust. The 1943 appointment diaries also document Himmler's growing role as a military commander, a role for which he was entirely unsuited, but which he pursued with characteristic determination. Hitler had grown increasingly distrustful of the traditional German army officer corps, whom he blamed for the defeats on the Eastern Front, and he turned more and more to the SS as an alternative military force that combined ideological reliability with combat capability. Himmler commanded Waffen-SS divisions in the field and, from 1943 onward, took on broader military responsibilities that gave him authority over ever larger formations. His appointment diaries from 1943 and 1944 show him shuttling between his role as head of the police and security apparatus and his emerging role as a military commander, a division of attention that his subordinates privately believed was stretching him too thin. Walter Schellenberg, the SS intelligence chief who worked closely with Himmler in the war's final years and wrote frankly about him in his post-war memoirs, described a man who was simultaneously trying to run an intelligence service, oversee a genocide, command military formations, administer occupied territories, manage racial resettlement programs, and maintain his personal relationship with Hitler, all while suffering from increasingly severe physical ailments that his doctors struggled to diagnose and treat. One of the more unexpected revelations of the journals concerns Himmler's interest in alternative medicine and what we might today call holistic or pseudoscientific health practices. His appointment diaries throughout the war years contain regular entries for sessions with Felix Kirsten, a Finnish-Estonian masseur, an alternative health practitioner who had become Himmler's personal physician. Kirsten's ability to relieve Himmler's chronic stomach cramps, which were likely psychosomatic in origin, gave him extraordinary access to the most powerful policeman in the Third Reich. Kirsten later wrote memoirs of their conversations, which he claimed to have recorded in real time, and while historians have debated the accuracy of some of his accounts, the fundamental picture he drew of Himmler as a man deeply invested in herbal remedies, alternative therapies, and pseudoscientific health theories is consistent with what the documentary record shows. Himmler was genuinely interested in homeopathy, in various forms of folk medicine, in the supposed health benefits of particular diets and agricultural practices. The SS-managed plantation at Dachau concentration camp, which produced medicinal herbs using prisoner labour, was a direct expression of Himmler's personal convictions about health and agriculture. His appointment diaries contain regular references to meetings with agronomists, herbalists, and health officials that sit incongruously alongside the entries for meetings with concentration camp administrators and security police chiefs. The man who was engineering the most systematic mass murder in history was simultaneously worried about the purity of the food supply and the therapeutic properties of stinging nettles. The journals also document Himmler's obsession with the occult and with what he believed was the authentic spiritual heritage of the Germanic people. He had, since his youth, been deeply interested in Germanic mythology, in the idea of an ancient Aryan civilization whose wisdom and racial purity had been obscured by the corrupting influence of Christianity and Jewish influence. He was drawn to runology, to the supposed mystical significance of various Nordic symbols, to accounts of Atlantis as the original Aryan homeland, to theories about the cosmological significance of the movements of celestial bodies. He funded and directed the Ahnenerbe, the SS Ancestral Heritage Organization, established in 1935, which conducted pseudoscientific research into the supposed origins and spiritual traditions of the Aryan race, sending expeditions to Tibet, to Scandinavia, to the Languedoc region of France in search of the Holy Grail, and to various other locations where Himmler believed traces of the ancient Aryan heritage might be found. His appointment diaries contain dozens of entries for meetings with Ahnenerbe researchers, archaeologists, and various intellectuals and cranks who fed his enthusiasm for these theories. He was particularly devoted to the medieval castle of Wewelsburg in Westphalia, which he had converted into an SS ceremonial centre and which he envisioned as a kind of mystical headquarters for a future SS order that would govern Europe after the war's victorious conclusion. His appointment diaries show him visiting Wewelsburg regularly throughout the war, overseeing its renovation, attending ceremonies there, and consulting with the architect Hermann Bartels about plans for its eventual completion. All of this, the occult, interests, the agricultural obsessions, the health anxieties, the sentimental family life, coexisted with the administrative reality that Himmler's offices were, on a daily basis, processing the deaths of thousands and then tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of human beings. The journals document this coexistence not through dramatic confrontations with the moral reality of what was happening, but through the simple, relentless accumulation of ordinary working days in which the genocide was simply one item among many on the schedule. This, historians have argued, is perhaps the most important lesson the journals teach, that the Holocaust was not accomplished through a sudden explosion of irrational violence, but through the patient, systematic application of bureaucratic procedure by men who had normalized the abnormal so thoroughly that mass murder could appear in an appointment diary, alongside agricultural meetings and medical consultations without any apparent sense of incongruity. The year 1944 brought the beginning of the end, and Himmler's appointment diaries from this period capture a man under enormous and escalating pressure trying to maintain his grip on a situation that was rapidly deteriorating. The Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, D-Day, opened a new front in the West that Germany could not sustain, while in the East the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, Operation Bagration, shattered Army Group Center and opened the way for the Red Army to advance toward Germany itself. Himmler's response to these military catastrophes followed a pattern by now familiar from his journals. He worked harder, took on more responsibilities, and channeled his anxieties into the ideological mission. July 1944 brought the most direct personal challenge of his career when, on July 20th, a group of German army officers attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb planted in his headquarters. Hitler survived, and in the aftermath of the plot, known as the July 20th plot, Himmler's power reached its apex. Hitler, whose distrust of the traditional officer corps was now absolute, gave Himmler command of the reserve army, the forces stationed within Germany, and tasked him with rooting out the conspirators and purging the officer corps of any remaining disloyal elements. Himmler's appointment diaries from the weeks after July 20th are among the most densely packed in the entire collection, recording a relentless schedule of interrogations, trials, executions, and reorganization meetings as the SS moved to consolidate its hold on the German military apparatus. The journals also document with painful clarity the acceleration of the killing in the summer and autumn of 1944. The deportation of Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz-Birkenau, which had begun in May 1944, was proceeding at a pace that strained even the vast killing infrastructure that the SS had built. In the space of approximately 8 weeks between May and July 1944, more than 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz, where the great majority were immediately gassed. Himmler's appointment diaries from this period document his meetings with the officials managing the deportations, including the SS officer Adolf Eichmann, who coordinated the deportations from Budapest. They also document the international pressure that was building on the Hungarian government, and by extension on Germany, to halt the deportations, pressure from the Vatican, from the International Red Cross, from neutral governments, and from Jewish organizations. Himmler's response to this pressure, as recorded in his journals and in separate diplomatic documents, was characteristically calculating. He was aware that Germany was losing the war, and he was beginning to think about what a post-war world might look like and what role he might play in it. The deportations of Hungarian Jews became, for him, a potential bargaining chip, a possibility he explored through back-channel negotiations with Jewish representatives in which he offered to slow or stop the deportations in exchange for material goods, most notably trucks and other war supplies. These negotiations, the so-called blood for goods talks, are documented in his appointment diaries and in the separate records of the negotiations themselves, and they reveal a man who was already, by mid-1944, beginning to hedge his bets. The final months of Himmler's story, from late 1944 through May 1945, are in many ways the most revealing, precisely because they show how completely his elaborate ideological edifice collapsed when confronted with the reality of military defeat. His appointment diaries from this period show a man struggling with a cognitive dissonance that had become impossible to sustain. He had spent his entire adult life in service to a system that promised racial and national salvation through total commitment to the ideological mission. Now, with Soviet forces approaching from the east and Allied forces advancing from the west and south, it was becoming impossible to maintain the fiction that the mission was succeeding. His appointment books from late 1944 and early 1945 show him taking on yet more military commands. He was appointed commander of Army Group Upper Rhine in December 1944 and Army Group Vistula in January 1945, for which he had neither the training nor the temperament, and performing disastrously in both roles. His generals found him indecisive, out of his depth, prone to delivering lengthy ideological speeches when what was needed was operational command decisions. He was, as one of his commanders later wrote in his memoirs, a man who had spent his career building organizations but who had no idea how to actually fight a battle. In the final months of the war, Himmler's journals document something remarkable: the beginning of a secret attempt to negotiate with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back. Working through various intermediaries, including his personal masseur Kirsten, the Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte, and the SS intelligence chief Walter Schellenberg, Himmler began from approximately February 1945 onward a series of secret contacts with Allied representatives. He believed, apparently sincerely, that the Western Allies might be willing to negotiate a separate peace with Germany that would allow the Wehrmacht to continue fighting the Soviets, that they would see, at the last moment, the utility of a strong Germany as a bulwark against communism, and would overlook the regime's crimes in the interest of geopolitical calculation. His appointment diaries from February through April 1945 document meetings with Kirsten and Schellenberg that, while recorded in typically brief terms, can now be understood in the context of the separate documentation of the back-channel negotiations. On April 23, 1945, in a meeting with Count Folke Bernadotte at the Swedish consulate in Lübeck, Himmler made an explicit offer to surrender Germany's forces on the Western Front, keeping the fight going in the East. Bernadotte transmitted the offer to the Western governments. It was rejected immediately, and when word of Himmler's negotiations reached Hitler, by this point barricaded in his underground bunker in Berlin, awaiting the end, the reaction was one of volcanic fury. Hitler stripped Himmler of all his offices and ordered his arrest. It is at this moment, the moment of Hitler's repudiation, that Himmler's journals, as a coherent record of his inner world, effectively come to an end. The final weeks of his life were marked by a desperate, almost pathetic attempt to evade capture and to preserve some semblance of his former authority. He travelled to Schleswig-Holstein in the far north of Germany as the war came to its end on May 8, 1945. In the chaos of the immediate post-war period, he attempted to disguise himself, shaving his distinctive moustache, covering his telltale spectacles with an eye patch, obtaining false papers in the name of a recently deceased Gestapo sergeant named Heinrich Himmler. He intended, apparently, to slip through the Allied lines and make his way to Bavaria, where he hoped to link up with what he imagined might be a surviving Nazi resistance network. Instead, on May 21, 1945, he was stopped at a British checkpoint near Bremerwörde. He was recognised and taken into custody. After 2 days of preliminary questioning by British intelligence officers, he was transferred to a more secure facility at Lüneburg for formal interrogation. On the evening of May 23, 1945, during a medical examination, Himmler bit down on a cyanide capsule that he had concealed in his mouth. He was dead within minutes. He was 44 years old. The discovery of his body created an immediate problem for the British authorities. They had a body and no documents. Almost everything Himmler had been carrying when he was captured, his papers, his personal effects, the small amount of baggage he had with him, was inventoried and searched. But the appointment diaries and personal journals that had constituted his private record were not among his possessions. Those had been left behind, captured by Allied forces at various points in the final months of the war, transported to different archival destinations, and in some cases simply overlooked in the vast mountains of captured German documentation. The process of reassembling Himmler's written record was the work of decades, and it is not complete even today. New documents continue to surface. In 2016, the discovery of a cache of Himmler's personal papers in Israel, held by the family of a former Israeli military intelligence officer who had obtained them in the late 1940s, brought previously unknown correspondence and personal notes to light, including letters that illuminated aspects of his private life and his ideological development that had not previously been documented. What do the journals, taken as a whole, tell us about Heinrich Himmler? They tell us that he was a true believer, not a cynic performing ideological conviction for professional advancement. His private writings, the letters to his wife, The notes in his appointment diaries, the speeches to his subordinates, are entirely consistent with one another in their expression of a genuine, deeply held conviction that he was doing necessary and historically justified work. He believed in the racial ideology he served. He believed that the murder of Europe's Jews was a historical necessity, a terrible but unavoidable obligation demanded by the laws of racial struggle. He believed that the SS was not simply an instrument of terror, but a new kind of human institution, a racial and spiritual elite that would shape the future of human civilization. The journals give no evidence of private doubt, of secret guilt, of the kind of inner moral conflict that some perpetrators of atrocity have claimed to have experienced. What they give, instead, is evidence of a man who was, in the truest sense, a fanatic. A man whose inner life and his outer actions were entirely aligned, who never had to suppress his conscience because the ideology had replaced his conscience with something else entirely. The journals also reveal the extent to which the Holocaust was not an anonymous, impersonal bureaucratic process, but one that was personally directed and overseen by specific individuals who knew precisely what they were doing. Himmler's appointment books place him repeatedly and unmistakably at the locations and in the meetings where the key decisions about the murder of European Jews were made and implemented. They document his visits to Auschwitz, his meetings with Eichmann, his instructions to the commanders of the Einsatzgruppen, his orders for the deportations from Hungary, his oversight of the gas chamber construction programs. The journals are, in the most literal sense, a record of the management of genocide, written in the hand of the man most responsible for managing it. For historians, the journals have been invaluable in reconstructing the chronology and organizational history of the Holocaust. They have helped establish when specific decisions were made, who was present at key meetings, how the bureaucratic chain of command functioned, and how the policy evolved from sporadic mass shootings in the East to the systematic industrial murder of Auschwitz. Peter Longerich's definitive 2008 biography of Himmler, the most comprehensive study of the man and his role, drew heavily on the appointment diaries and personal correspondence, using them to establish a detailed day-by-day account of Himmler's involvement in the Holocaust that was more precise and more thoroughly documented than anything previously possible. Richard Evans, in his trilogy on the Third Reich, and Christopher Browning, in his landmark study of the decision-making process behind the final solution, also relied on Himmler's documentary record to trace the evolution of Nazi genocide from its origins to its industrialized peak. The journals have also been significant in legal contexts. At the Nuremberg trials, documents from Himmler's files, captured in the chaotic final days of the war and rapidly assembled by Allied prosecutors, were used as evidence against the defendants. Himmler himself was beyond the reach of justice, having died before the trials began, but his documents helped establish the guilt of those who had served under him and alongside him. In subsequent war crimes trials, the Einsatzgruppen trial, the High Command trial, the Pole case, further documents from Himmler's administrative empire were introduced as evidence, helping to prove the deliberate, organized, and ordered nature of the mass murders for which the defendants were charged. The journals were not merely historical documents, they were instruments of legal accountability, helping to ensure that at least some of those responsible for the Holocaust were held to answer for their crimes. In more recent decades, the continuing discovery and publication of Himmler's private correspondence has added new dimensions to our understanding of the man. The letters between Himmler and his wife Marga, many of which were published in German in 2014 and drew wide attention, reveal the texture of a long, somewhat unhappy marriage in which both partners were fully committed to National Socialism, but in which the personal chemistry was often strained. Marga Himmler was, by all accounts, a difficult and demanding woman, and her letters to her husband frequently complain about his absences, his preoccupations, his failure to attend to family matters. Himmler's replies are patient, sometimes affectionate, sometimes clearly exasperated, the ordinary communications of a troubled marriage, remarkable only for the context in which they occurred. The letters between Himmler and Hedwig Potthast, by contrast, are warmer and more emotionally forthcoming. A man allowing himself a degree of intimacy and vulnerability that his public role and his domestic arrangement did not easily accommodate. The children of Heinrich Himmler represent another dimension of the documentary legacy he left behind. His daughter Gudrun Himmler, born in 1929, was by all accounts the child he was closest to. He called her Puppy in his private letters and wrote about her with evident pride and tenderness. Gudrun Himmler had an extraordinarily difficult post-war trajectory. She was 11 years old when the war ended, old enough to have been deeply marked by her father's prominence and by the circumstances of his death. She reportedly visited him briefly in British custody in the final days before his suicide. In the decades that followed the war, unlike many children of senior Nazi officials who tried to distance themselves from their father's legacy, Gudrun Himmler moved in neo-Nazi circles, became active in the organization Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, which provided assistance to convicted Nazi war criminals and their families, and consistently refused to condemn her father's crimes. She died in May 2018 at the age of 88 without ever having publicly disavowed what her father had done. Her intransigence was perhaps the final, bitter echo of the worldview that her father's journals so extensively documented. The two children Himmler fathered with Hedwig Potthast, Helga, born in 1942, and Nanette Dorothea, born in 1944, had quieter post-war lives. Both were given up to relatives and foster families in the confusion of the post-war period. Helga Himmler lived a largely private life in Germany, rarely speaking publicly about his origins. Nanette Dorothea Potthast, whose birth is noted in Himmler's appointment diary with characteristic brevity, similarly sought to build a life away from the shadow of her father's name. The children who survived Heinrich Himmler were in many ways themselves casualties of the world he had created, marked by his legacy without having chosen it, required to navigate an identity that the journals of their father had helped make infamous. The question of what the journals mean for how we understand perpetrators of mass atrocity remains one of the most important questions in Holocaust historiography. Hannah Arendt's famous formulation of the banality of evil, developed in her coverage of the Adolf Eichmann trial in Jerusalem in 1961, argued that the bureaucratic perpetrators of the Holocaust were not demons or monsters, but ordinary men and women who had subordinated their individual moral judgment to institutional role and ideological commitment. The phrase has been debated ever since. Some historians find it too exculpatory, suggesting too strongly that the perpetrators were simply following orders rather than making active choices. Himmler's journals complicate the picture in important ways. He was not, as the journals make clear, a banal figure in any meaningful sense. He was an intensely engaged, ideologically passionate, administratively creative man who was not following orders so much as writing them. He was not the instrument of the Holocaust, he was, to a very great degree, its architect. And yet the journals also confirm something of Arendt's insight, that this monstrous undertaking was carried out by a man who organized his day-to-day existence in ways that would be recognizable in any large bureaucracy, who worried about staff morale and agricultural productivity and the health of his children, who maintained the routines and relationships of an ordinary human life, even as he was engineering the murder of millions. One of the most significant archival events in the history of Himmler scholarship came in 2014 when the auction house Hermann Historica in Munich offered for sale a collection of previously unknown Himmler documents, including personal notebooks and correspondence that had apparently been in private hands since the end of the war. The sale caused immediate controversy. Historians argued that such documents belonged in public archives, accessible to researchers, not in private collections where they might disappear again, and it eventually resulted in at least some of the documents being acquired by German archives. Among the items that surfaced was a notebook from the early 1930s in which Himmler had recorded his personal reflections on ideology, his assessments of colleagues and subordinates, and his plans for the SS's future development. These notes, more than any of the appointment diary entries, gave scholars a glimpse into Himmler's interior world, his ambitions, his hatreds, his fantasies about the future, in his own unguarded prose. The reflections recorded in these early notebooks are deeply revealing of how Himmler understood his own role in history. He wrote about the SS not merely as a police or military organization, but as the nucleus of a future Germanic civilization, a self-selecting community of the racially and ideologically pure who would, after the war's victorious conclusion, become the governing class of a new European order. He imagined SS men settling the conquered eastern territories as farmer soldiers, tilling the soil and defending the frontier against what he imagined as the perpetual threat from the east. He imagined Wewelsburg Castle as the spiritual center of this new order, a place where SS leaders would gather to deliberate on the great questions of governance and ideology in a setting that combined the gravitas of a medieval fortress with the rationality of a modern administrative center. He imagined ceremonies and rituals that would replace the religious traditions of Christianity with a new SS mysticism grounded in Germanic mythology and racial science. These were not incidental fantasies. They were central to his vision of what the war was for and what victory would mean. And the journals document not just the fantasy, but the steps he took to begin realizing it, even in the midst of a war whose conduct consumed almost all of his available resources. The appointment diaries from 1943 and 1944 also document Himmler's increasingly complex and sometimes fraught relationships with other senior figures in the Nazi hierarchy. His relationship with Hermann Göring, the head of the Luftwaffe and nominally the second man in the Nazi state, was characterized by mutual suspicion and bureaucratic rivalry. Göring resented Himmler's growing power, particularly the SS's encroachment into areas that he considered his own domain. His relationship with Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, was cool. Goebbels was contemptuous of what he considered Himmler's intellectual limitations and his occult enthusiasms, and Himmler was wary of Goebbels' razor-sharp intelligence and his direct access to Hitler. His relationship with Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary who managed the Führer's schedule and controlled access to him, was cautiously respectful. Bormann was not a man to make an enemy of given his unique position, and Himmler was careful in his dealings with him. The appointment diaries capture these relationships not through emotional reflection, but through the pattern of meetings and contacts they record. Who Himmler met with, how often, in what context. Historians have used these patterns to map the political dynamics of the Nazi leadership with a precision that would not otherwise be possible. The foreign relations dimension of Himmler's journals is also significant. His appointment diaries and personal correspondence document his extensive involvement in the SS's foreign intelligence activities, which overlapped substantially with his police functions. The SD, the Sicherheitsdienst or security service, the SS's internal intelligence. Arm, under the successive leadership of Reinhard Heydrich and then Ernst Kaltenbrunner, maintained networks of agents and informants across occupied Europe and in neutral countries. Himmler's appointment books show him receiving regular intelligence briefings, meeting with foreign agents and their handlers, and in some cases, directly managing sensitive foreign operations. His contacts with neutral governments, Sweden, Switzerland, and in the war's final phase, various American and British intelligence representatives, are partially documented in his appointment diaries and more fully in the separate records of those negotiations. These contacts reveal a man who was, by 1944 and 1945, desperately trying to use the resources of his intelligence network to establish back-channel communications that might allow him to survive the war's end in some form of political capacity. The physical condition of Himmler's surviving journals presents its own challenges for historians. The appointment diaries that were recovered from Soviet archives in the 1990s were in varying states of preservation, damaged by the passage of time and by the conditions of their storage. Some pages were illegible or only partially legible. The handwriting, which Himmler maintained in a small, precise German script, required expert analysis in some cases. The abbreviations and shorthand notations he used, which had been clear to his contemporary readers, required historical context to decode. RF for Reichsführer, in reference to his own title, various SS rank abbreviations, coded references to particular operations and individuals that only made sense in the light of other documents. The work of transcribing, translating, and annotating these diaries was the labor of teams of archivists and historians working over many years. The result is a documentary corpus that is, even now, not fully published or fully analysed, a fact that means the historical scholarship on Himmler, substantial as it already is likely to continue developing as new materials are processed and made available. What can we say in conclusion about the significance of what Himmler's journals reveal? They are, first and foremost, evidence, legal and historical, of the deliberate, organised and personally directed nature of the Holocaust. They contradict any claim that the genocide was the product of anonymous bureaucratic forces operating without individual human direction and decision-making. They place specific people in specific places at specific times and document specific decisions about the murder of specific groups of human beings. Second, they are a portrait of an ideological true believer. A man whose public actions and private writings are entirely consistent with one another, who never shows evidence of private doubt or concealed moral revulsion. Third, they are a record of how ideology can colonize an entire human consciousness, displacing ordinary moral, judgment, and replacing it with a system of values so thoroughly internalized that mass murder can be accommodated alongside family correspondence and agricultural meetings without any apparent cognitive strain. And fourth, they are a reminder of the importance of documentary evidence in the ongoing task of historical accountability, of the work that archivists, historians, and institutions perform in preserving and making accessible the records that allow future generations to understand, in as complete and accurate a way as possible, what happened and how. The journals of Heinrich Himmler are uncomfortable documents to read precisely because they are not the writings of an alien mind. They are the writings of a man who moved through recognizable human experiences: professional ambition, family love, physical vulnerability, bureaucratic frustration, ideological commitment, and who arrived through a series of choices that were, at each stage, comprehensible within his own system of values at the most monstrous destination in the history of the modern world. The discomfort they produce is the right discomfort. The discomfort of recognition, of proximity, of the realization that the machinery of genocide was assembled not by monsters from some other species of humanity, but by human beings operating within a human institution according to a human ideology. That is the lesson that Himmler's journals teach, and it is a lesson that cannot be taught too many times or studied too carefully, because it is the lesson that history most urgently needs us to learn. The story of how those journals were found, preserved, studied, and placed into the historical record is also, in its way, a story worth telling. A story about the men and women who dedicated their professional lives to the unglamorous and sometimes dangerous work of archival recovery and historical scholarship, who travelled to Moscow and Washington and Jerusalem and Koblenz in search of documents that would help the world understand what had happened in Europe between 1933 and 1945. Without their work, the portrait of Himmler that we have today, detailed, documented, historically grounded, would be very different, and the world's understanding of how the Holocaust happened would be correspondingly poorer. The journals matter not just because of what they contain, but because of what they prove, that the truth, even when those who made it tried their hardest to destroy the evidence, has a way of surviving. The particular obsession that runs through Himmler's journals from the very earliest entries to the very last is the concept of the Germanic race, what it was, where it came from, how it should be cultivated, and what destiny it was meant to fulfill in the long sweep of history. This obsession was not, in Himmler's case, a cynical rhetorical device adopted for political purposes. It was the genuine centre of his intellectual and spiritual world. His early diaries from the 1920s, the ones that survive from his student years and the first years of his involvement in the Nazi movement, show a young man who read voraciously in the literature of race science, of Germanic mythology, of Völkisch nationalism, of anti-Semitism, with the focused enthusiasm of a convert who has found his faith. He read Gobineau's essay on the inequality of the human races, Houston Stewart Chamberlain's The Foundations of the 19th Century, the racial theories of Hans F. K. Günther, the man known in Nazi circles as Reis Günther for his prolific output of racial pseudoscience, and dozens of lesser-known works of similar character. He noted his reactions in his diary, what he found convincing, what he found wanting, where he disagreed with particular arguments, and where he found them confirmed by his own observation and experience. These early annotations are the raw material out of which the ideology of the SS would eventually be constructed. By the time Himmler took command of the SS in January 1929, at the age of 28 with a membership of fewer than 300 men, he had a fully developed vision of what he wanted the organization to be. His appointment as Reichsführer SS, initially a modest position within the larger SA paramilitary structure, gave him the vehicle he needed to begin realizing that vision. His journals from 1929 through 1933 document the painstaking process of building the SS from a small personal bodyguard unit into the most powerful institution in the Third Reich. He recruited carefully, emphasizing not just ideological reliability, but physical characteristics. Height, build, the alleged racial markers of Nordic ancestry. He instituted the SS marriage regulation in 1931, which required SS members to obtain approval from the SS race office before marrying, submitting their prospective wives to racial and genealogical examination to ensure that no undesirable blood entered the SS lineage. This regulation, which he regarded as the cornerstone of the SS's racial integrity, is discussed at length in his personal writings, with the earnestness of a man who genuinely believed that careful management of human breeding could produce, over several generations, a new and higher type of human being. The appointment diaries from the years 1933 to 1938, the period in which Hitler came to power and in which Himmler progressively extended his control over the German police system, document the methodical, patient, relentless expansion of SS power. In January 1933, when Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, Himmler was still primarily a regional police figure, head of the Munich police. By June 1936, when Hitler consolidated all German police forces under a single national command and appointed Himmler to lead them as Chief of German Police, Himmler had achieved something that had never existed in Germany before: a unified national police apparatus that answered not to the Interior Ministry or any other civilian authority, but directly to him, operating in a grey zone of legal authority that made it, in practice, an institution entirely beyond the normal constraints of law. His appointment diaries from 1936 capture the organizational pleasure he took in this achievement, the meetings with police officials across Germany as he extended his personal authority, the establishment of new SS and police structures, the progressive subordination of the regular criminal police and political police to SS control. The Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei or secret state police, deserves particular attention in the context of Himmler's journals, because it was, of all the instruments of repression he commanded, the one most directly involved in the day-to-day mechanics of terror and persecution within Germany itself. Originally established in Prussia under Hermann Göring in 1933, the Gestapo had passed to Himmler's control by 1934, and was subsequently merged with the broader SS security apparatus under Reinhard Heydrich. Himmler's appointment diaries show him in regular contact with Gestapo leadership throughout the pre-war and wartime period, receiving reports on the numbers of people arrested, the cases under investigation, the categories of enemies being monitored and prosecuted. The Gestapo's victims included not only Jews and political opponents, but Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, habitual criminals defined as asocials, Sinti and Roma people, the physically and mentally disabled, and the vast range of people who fell afoul of the Third Reich's increasingly comprehensive definition of who was and was not an acceptable German citizen. All of these categories of persecution are reflected in greater or lesser detail in the documentary record that Himmler left behind. One of the most significant revelations of the journals concerns the extent of Himmler's personal involvement in the persecution of homosexuals, a dimension of his role that has received somewhat less historical attention than his direction of the Holocaust against Jewish people, but that was, in his own mind, of comparable ideological importance. Himmler regarded homosexuality as one of the gravest threats to the demographic future of the Germanic race. A plague that diverted men capable of fathering children away from their biological duty and weakened the racial stock. His private writings on this subject are among the most disturbing in the entire journal corpus, combining genuine ideological conviction with a visceral personal revulsion that historians have sometimes read as potentially connected to anxieties about his own sexual identity. Whether or not that interpretation is correct, and it remains speculative, what is documented beyond any doubt is the practical consequence of his convictions. The systematic persecution of gay men in Germany and occupied Europe, their incarceration in concentration camps where they were forced to wear pink triangles to mark their status, and the deaths of an estimated 15 to 50,000 gay men in the camp system. His appointment diaries contain entries for meetings with officials involved in this persecution, and his personal correspondence includes passages in which he discusses what he considered the proper treatment of homosexuals with the same cold administrative rationality he brought to every other aspect of his work. The journals also document Himmler's relationship with the concentration camp system in considerable detail. Not only the extermination camps in Poland that were specifically designed for the murder of Jews and others, but the broader camp network that had begun in Germany in 1933 and had expanded dramatically with the war. The first concentration camp, Dachau, had been established in March 1933, just weeks after Hitler came to power, and Himmler had been personally involved in its creation from the beginning. He had appointed Theodor Eicke as its commandant in 1933, and it was Eicke who developed the Dachau system, the set of disciplinary regulations and organizational principles that became the template for all subsequent camps. Himmler approved this system personally and championed its implementation across the growing camp network. His appointment diaries show him visiting concentration camps throughout the pre-war and wartime period. Dachau, Mauthausen, Auschwitz, Neuengamme and others, not as a horrified observer, but as a proprietorial administrator, checking on the efficient operation of a system he had built and in which he took genuine institutional pride. The wartime expansion of the concentration camp system into a vast network of slave labor enterprises represents another dimension of Himmler's documented activities. By 1942, he had concluded an agreement with Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, by which concentration camp prisoners would be provided as slave labor to German war industries. The SS would retain control of the prisoners and extract a rental fee from the companies that used them. The result was a sprawling economic enterprise that bound some of Germany's largest industrial corporations, including IG Farben, Krupp, Siemens, BMW, and many others, into direct complicity with the camp system. Himmler's appointment diaries from 1942 and 1943 show him meeting regularly with Speer, with industrialists, and with the SS economic officials who managed what amounted to a slave labor empire. The meetings are recorded in the same terse format as all his other appointments, giving no indication that anything unusual was being discussed. But the context provided by the broader historical record makes clear that what was being arranged in these meetings was the systematic exploitation of human beings, worked to exhaustion and death in conditions of deliberate brutality in service of the German war economy. The IRA figures are staggering. By the end of the war, the SS camp system encompassed hundreds of main camps and sub-camps across German-controlled Europe, containing at any given time hundreds of thousands of prisoners in conditions of extreme deprivation. The mortality rate was catastrophic. In some camps and in some periods, the majority of prisoners who entered did not survive. The combination of deliberate murder, starvation, exposure, overwork, disease, and medical experimentation created a death toll that historians have estimated in the millions. And all of this, the organization, the administration, the economics, the systematic brutality, is documented to a remarkable degree in the records that Himmler and his subordinates created and that have survived in archives around the world. The medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners represent one of the most disturbing chapters in Himmler's documented activities. His appointment diaries and personal correspondence show him taking a direct personal interest in a range of scientific experiments conducted on prisoners without their consent, experiments that were, in many cases, deliberately designed to cause extreme suffering and death. The high-altitude experiments at Dachau, in which prisoners were placed in low-pressure chambers simulating extreme altitude to observe their physiological responses, killed numerous subjects. The hypothermia experiments, also at Dachau, involved prisoners being immersed in ice water to study the limits of human cold tolerance, experiments that provided information the Luftwaffe wanted about survival prospects for pilots shot down over the North Sea. At Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp, SS doctors conducted bone, muscle and nerve transplant experiments on female Polish prisoners, deliberately inflicting wounds and infections to study the effects. At Auschwitz, the SS doctor Josef Mengele conducted his notorious experiments on twins, dwarfs and others, sending samples and data to German academic institutions. Himmler's appointment diaries show him meeting with some of the doctors involved in these programs, receiving reports on their progress and in some cases personally directing the expansion of experimental programs. His personal correspondence includes letters in which he discusses the scientific value of the experiments with a detached enthusiasm that is among the most disturbing aspects of his documentary record. The journals also illuminate Himmler's role in the persecution and murder of the Sinti and Roma, the people the Nazis called gypsies, which has sometimes been overshadowed in public historical consciousness by the far better-known dimensions of Nazi genocide, but which was, in its proportions, a catastrophe of comparable magnitude within the affected communities. Himmler was personally engaged with what he called the gypsy question from an early date. His interest combined the standard Nazi racial obsessions with an additional layer of pseudo-anthropological curiosity. He was genuinely fascinated in a grotesque way by the question of the Sinti and Roma's racial origins, toying at various points with the idea that they might represent a degenerate remnant of the original Aryan migration and therefore occupied a special position in the racial hierarchy. This theoretical curiosity did not ultimately moderate the practical consequences. His appointment diaries from 1942 and 1943 document meetings and directives that led to the mass deportation of Sinti and Roma to Auschwitz-Birkenau, where a special gypsy camp was established. In the summer of 1944, as the war's end approached and Himmler ordered the camp liquidated, the inmates of the gypsy camp, more than 4,000 men, women and children, were murdered in the gas chambers in a single night. The total number of Sinti and Roma murdered by the Nazi regime is estimated at between 500,000 and 1.5 million, a range that reflects the extraordinary difficulty of accurately documenting the deaths of communities that left few written records and whose persecution was, for decades after the war, inadequately recognized by official institutions. Himmler's journals from the period of German occupation of the Soviet Union, 1941 through 1944, are essential sources for understanding the nature of Nazi rule in the East, which differed significantly in character from German occupation policies in Western Europe. In the West, Hitler and Himmler distinguished, however hypocritically, between occupied nations whose populations were considered racially acceptable Germanic or related peoples, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, and those considered racially inferior, like the French, who were nonetheless treated with a degree of formality and restraint. In the East, no such restraint applied. The Slavic peoples of the Soviet Union were, in Nazi ideology, Untermenschen, subhumans, whose territory was destined for German colonization, and whose populations would be partly enslaved, partly expelled, and partly murdered to make room for German settlers. The scope of the vision was extraordinary. Himmler's personal papers from the early war years include a document known as the General Plan East, a long-range planning document that sketched out the intended transformation of the occupied Soviet territories over a period of 20 years, involving the expulsion or murder of tens of millions of Slavic people and their replacement by millions of German settlers. The document, which was prepared under Himmler's supervision and reflects his personal vision for the post-war East, is one of the most chilling planning documents in the entire Nazi record. A blueprint for demographic engineering on a continental scale that makes the Holocaust, horrific as it was, look like merely one component of a far larger project of racial reorganization. The appointment diaries from the period of the Soviet occupation document Himmler's repeated visits to the Eastern Territories, where he inspected SS and police units, toured prisoner of war camps, reviewed anti-partisan operations, and oversaw the implementation of the racial resettlement policies he had planned. His visits to the occupied Soviet Union were, by all accounts, tours of inspection by a man who took genuine satisfaction in what he saw: the SS and police apparatus performing its functions, the vast occupied territories being brought under German administrative control, the racial mission being carried out. The appointment book entries for these visits are typically spare: place names, times, names of officers met with, but they can be cross-referenced with the separate reports and correspondence generated by the visits to reconstruct a detailed picture of what Himmler saw and what he directed. The Soviet Union was, in Himmler's vision, the great laboratory of National Socialism, the space where all the ideological theories about race and space and destiny would be tested and, he believed, vindicated by historical reality. The anti-partisan operations that Himmler directed in the occupied East deserve particular attention because they represent one of the most extensively documented aspects of his wartime activities and one of the most clear-cut demonstrations of his personal responsibility for the mass murder of civilians. As Soviet partisan resistance to German occupation grew from 1942 onward, Himmler directed the SS and police units in the occupied territories to conduct increasingly brutal pacification campaigns, operations that, in practice, meant the systematic murder of entire villages suspected of harboring or supporting partisans, the burning of crops and homes, and the deportation of surviving civilians to forced labor camps or to their deaths. These operations had names: Operation Bamberg, Operation Hamburg, Operation Cottbus, Operation Hermann, a clinical nomenclature that concealed the reality of massacres of unarmed civilians. Himmler's appointment diaries document his oversight of these operations, and his personal correspondence includes letters in which he ordered that the operations be conducted with particular ruthlessness, explicitly instructing his commanders that no military-age male found in areas of partisan activity was to be treated as a civilian, regardless of whether he was actually involved in partisan activity. The death toll from these operations in Belarus, Ukraine, and the occupied Russian territories was in the hundreds of thousands. The relationship between Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, the man who served as his chief deputy and who was, in many respects, the most operationally effective member of the SS leadership, is one of the most significant relationships documented in the journals, and also one of the most complex. Heydrich, who headed the Reich Security Main Office from its establishment in 1939 until his assassination in Prague in May 1942, was in many ways the operational brain behind the SS's security and repressive functions. He was brilliant, cold, ruthlessly efficient, and personally feared even by senior Nazi officials who dealt with him regularly. Himmler recognized his abilities and used them relentlessly, but he was also, by multiple accounts, somewhat intimidated by Heydrich, aware that his deputy was in many respects more capable than he was himself. His appointment diaries show him in close and regular contact with Heydrich throughout the period from 1936 until Heydrich's death, meeting with him frequently and relying on him for the operational direction of the security apparatus. When Heydrich was assassinated, shot by Czech and Slovak parachutists trained by the British Special Operations Executive on May 27, 1942, dying of his wounds on June 4th, Himmler's personal correspondence from the days that followed suggests a man who was genuinely grief-stricken, though the grief was quickly channeled into the characteristic response of administrative fury, the order for the total destruction of the Czech villages of Lidis and Ležáky, and the murder of their inhabitants, as collective reprisals for the assassination. The journals from the period of Heydrich's leadership of the RSHA also document the establishment and operation of the SD, the SS Intelligence Service, as a comprehensive surveillance and intelligence apparatus covering not only Germany's enemies abroad but also the German population itself. SD reports, known as SD-Berichte, or Meldungen aus dem Reich, provided regular assessments of German public opinion on a wide range of subjects: attitudes toward the war, toward specific leaders, toward food shortages, toward the bombing campaign, toward the fate of the Jews. These reports were delivered to Himmler through the SD chain of command and are referenced in his appointment diaries. They constitute one of the most extraordinary archives of public opinion data from Nazi Germany, capturing what ordinary Germans actually thought and said about the regime they lived under, and Himmler valued them highly precisely because they gave him an accurate picture of the domestic political climate that the propaganda minister's more optimistic reports sometimes concealed. The 1944 documentation is particularly rich with respect to Himmler's back-channel diplomatic activities, which, as the war moved toward its catastrophic conclusion for Germany, became an increasingly central preoccupation. The appointment diaries from 1944 show him meeting with a succession of intermediaries and emissaries through whom he hoped to establish contact with Allied representatives. One of the most significant of these contacts was with the American Office of Strategic Services, the wartime predecessor to the CIA, through intermediaries in Switzerland. Walter Schellenberg, who managed much of this activity, later wrote in his memoirs that Himmler was convinced that the Western Allies would, when confronted with the reality of Soviet power, eventually recognize that their true interest lay in a negotiated arrangement with Germany. He believed this with a persistence that defied the available evidence, continuing to develop back-channel schemes even as the military situation made any such outcome increasingly implausible. The negotiations with the World Jewish Congress through its Swedish representative Norbert Masur, which took place on April 19th and 20th, 1945, just days before the German surrender, represent perhaps the most extraordinary entry in the entire diary record. Himmler met personally with Masur at the Hohenlichen Sanatorium north of Berlin, in what was almost certainly the first and last meeting between the man most responsible for the Holocaust and a representative of the Jewish people. His appointment diary records the meeting, briefly as always, but the content of the conversation is documented in Masur's own account, published after the war. Himmler reportedly spent much of the meeting justifying the persecution of the Jews, presenting it as a defensive measure against Jewish communism and Allied manipulation, and then offered to release several thousand Jewish women from the Ravensbrück concentration camp as a goodwill gesture. Masur accepted the offer, and the women were released. Himmler, in his own apparent understanding, had demonstrated his usefulness as a negotiating partner. In reality, he had demonstrated the completeness of his self-delusion, that the man who had organized the murder of 6 million Jews believed that releasing a few thousand concentration camp prisoners might be sufficient to earn him a place in the post-war political order. The final diary entries, sparse, fragmented, clearly written under conditions of extreme stress, capture a man whose entire frame of reference has collapsed. The system he had built was disintegrating. The ideology that had given his life meaning was being defeated on the battlefield. The racial empire he had imagined was being overrun, and the leader he had worshipped and served, Adolf Hitler, had repudiated him as a traitor, stripping him of everything. His last known personal correspondence, written in the days between Hitler's repudiation and his capture by the British, shows a man who was still, even then, casting about for some framework that would allow him to maintain a sense of purpose and direction. He wrote to his adjutant Heine about the possibility of forming a resistance movement in the post-war period. He seems genuinely to have entertained the idea that he might play some role in the future political life of Germany. Perhaps negotiating with the Allies from a position of informational value, offering his knowledge of the SS apparatus and its intelligence networks in exchange for some form of immunity or political recognition. The delusion was comprehensive and impervious to reality. It was only in the final hours before his death, alone in a British military facility in Lüneburg, that the reality of his situation finally became undeniable. He chose the cyanide capsule rather than face the tribunal that he knew would have followed. The historians who have worked most closely with Himmler's journals have sometimes spoken about the experience of reading them with a particular kind of difficulty, not because the material is unclear or ambiguous, but because it is so clear and so unambiguous. The appointment diaries do not leave room for comfortable interpretive distance. They put Himmler at the scene, in the meeting, on the phone, giving the order, receiving the report, overseeing the operation. They document his personal knowledge and personal direction of events that resulted in the deaths of millions of people with a specificity and precision that no revisionist interpretation can evade. When historians like Longerich, Evans, or Browning sit with these documents, they are not engaged in detection or inference. They are reading, in the perpetrator's own hand, a record that speaks for itself. The moral weight of that encounter with the primary source is, by all accounts, considerable. The German philosopher and Holocaust scholar Dan Diner has written about what he calls the sealed-off world of the perpetrators, the way in which the ideological framework within which men like Himmler operated constituted a complete and self-referential system of meaning that made the crimes they committed not merely comprehensible, but within that system, necessary and even noble. The journals are the primary evidence for what that sealed-off world looked like from the inside. They show a man who was not conflicted, not secretly troubled, not performing ideological conviction while harbouring private doubts. They show a man for whom the ideology was the reality, in whom the ideology had so thoroughly displaced normal moral perception that the murder of millions could coexist in the same appointment book, on the same working day, with meetings about herbal medicine and agricultural policy, without any apparent sense of contradiction or strain. This is not a comfortable conclusion, but it is the one that the documentary record demands. The question of what responsibility the SS as an institution, as opposed to Himmler as an individual, bears for the Holocaust is also illuminated by the journals. The Nuremberg Tribunal declared the SS a criminal organization on September 30th, 1946, a finding that reflected the tribunal's judgment that membership in the SS in itself constituted participation in a criminal conspiracy. Himmler's journals help explain why this judgment was appropriate. They document an institution that was, from Himmler's perspective, precisely a tool of ideological mission rather than a conventional police or military organization. The SS was designed to be, and functioned as, the instrument through which a racial ideology was implemented in reality through persecution, displacement, imprisonment, and murder. Its criminality was not incidental to its function. It was constitutive of it. The men who built it, led it, and served in it were not ordinary soldiers or policemen who happened to be caught up in criminal activity. They were members of an organization whose criminal activity was its primary purpose. The use of Himmler's documents in post-war legal proceedings extended well beyond Nuremberg. In subsequent West German trials of former SS and Nazi officials, which were conducted with varying degrees of thoroughness and justice throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, Himmler's appointment diaries and personal correspondence served as crucial evidence linking specific defendants to specific crimes. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trial of 1963 to 1965, which prosecuted a number of former Auschwitz functionaries, relied heavily on SS documentation, including material from Himmler's administrative empire, to establish the systematic and ordered nature of the killing process. The trial played an important role in confronting West German society with the reality of what the Nazi regime had done, and in breaking down the widespread post-war fiction that the Holocaust had been the work of a small group of fanatics, rather than a broad institutional project involving the knowing participation of hundreds of thousands of Germans. The question of what Himmler knew about his crimes and when is answered definitively and comprehensively by the journals. There is not a single aspect of the persecution and murder of Jews and others that is not documented to some degree in his personal appointment diaries or correspondence. From the anti-Jewish boycott of April 1933 to the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau, from the Nuremberg laws of 1935 to the deportations of Hungarian Jews in 1944, Himmler was present, involved, directing, overseeing, and in many cases, personally ordering. The question of knowledge is not, in his case, a question at all. The question is only one of documentation, and the documentation is extraordinarily extensive. What, finally, are we to make of the man who wrote these journals? History has produced few individuals who combine such ordinariness of person with such enormity of deed. Himmler was not a genius. He was not a man of great personal magnetism or intellectual originality. He was a diligent, organized, methodical man of mediocre native abilities who had found, in National Socialism and in the SS, a vehicle for his ambitions that had given shape and purpose to a life that might otherwise have been quite unremarkable. The ideology had made him powerful beyond anything he could have achieved in an ordinary career. It had given him a sense of mission, a sense of belonging to something larger than himself, a sense of participating in history. And in exchange for those gifts, he had surrendered whatever moral conscience he might once have possessed and had placed himself, his intelligence, his organizational energy, and his considerable administrative gifts in the service of the worst crime in recorded history. The journals survive him. They will outlast whatever political or cultural circumstances might otherwise tempt future generations to minimize, relativize, or deny what happened. They are the record, precise, detailed, incontrovertible, of what one man did and what one organization he built accomplished between 1929 and 1945. They are the evidence that cannot be explained away or reinterpreted out of existence, and they serve, in the most direct way possible, as the foundation for the historical judgment that the generation who witnessed these events and the generations that have followed are obligated to render, that what happened was a crime of the most extreme, kind, planned, and executed by human beings who made choices and bore responsibility, and that those choices and that responsibility must be named and acknowledged as long as there are human beings who can read and understand what the documents say. The broader archival context in which Himmler's journals sit is worth considering at some length, because those journals did not exist in isolation. They were produced by a man who ran one of the most document-generating bureaucracies in history, and the records of that bureaucracy are themselves among the most important sources for Holocaust research available to scholars. The SSRSHA, the Reich Security Main Office that coordinated the security and intelligence functions of the SS under Heydrich and later Kaltenbrunner, produced millions of documents during its years of operation. The concentration camp system generated vast quantities of administrative records, prisoner registration forms, transport logs, death books, medical records, labor assignment rosters, construction plans, supply requisitions. The racial and resettlement agencies produced studies, surveys, maps, population projections, and policy documents. The Einsatzgruppen submitted regular operational reports documenting the numbers of people they had murdered. All of this documentation taken together constitutes one of the most complete records of a criminal enterprise that has ever been preserved. A record that the perpetrators created themselves in the normal course of administering their system, and that has proven invaluable to historians, prosecutors, and educators working to understand and communicate what happened. The preservation and accessibility of these records has been the work of archivists and institutions across multiple countries over the past 8 decades. The International Tracing Service, established after the war to help survivors locate family members and to document the fates of concentration camp prisoners, accumulated one of the largest collections of Nazi-era records in existence, more than 50 million documents relating to the persecution and murder of Nazi victims. For decades, the ITS's holdings were largely inaccessible to researchers, preserved at Bad Arolsen in Germany behind restrictive access policies designed to protect the privacy of survivors and victims. From 2007 onward, following a policy change driven by survivors' advocacy groups and governments, the ITS archive was progressively open to researchers, and copies of the holdings were transferred to archives in multiple countries, including Yad Vashem in Israel, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, and several European institutions. The opening of the ITS archive was a landmark event in Holocaust documentation, making accessible tens of millions of pages of records that scholars have only begun to fully analyze. Himmler's own records are held in a dispersed set of institutions. The largest collection is at the German Federal Archives, the Bundesarchiv, with holdings in Berlin and Koblenz that include extensive SS records captured by Allied forces at the end of the war. The National Archives of the United States holds captured German documents that were brought to Washington as part of the massive Allied documentation effort of 1945 and 1946. The Russian State Military Archive and the Special Archive in Moscow hold substantial collections of captured Nazi documents, including the Himmler appointment diaries from 1938 to 1944. Yad Vashem in Jerusalem holds copies of many key documents. The Wiener Library in London, one of the oldest Holocaust research institutions in the world, holds additional material, and various other archives and institutions around the world hold fragments of the record, letters, reports, memoranda, that, taken together, constitute the documentary legacy of the Third Reich. The ongoing work of historical scholarship on Himmler and the SS is not merely an academic exercise. It has practical consequences for how societies understand and confront the historical realities of the Nazi period. In Germany, the encounter with this history has been a defining element of the country's post-war political and cultural development, a process of what Germans call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or coming to terms with the past, that has been difficult, contested, incomplete, and yet ultimately essential to the construction of a democratic German political culture. The role of documents like Himmler's journals in this process has been central. They have provided the irrefutable evidence that made denial impossible and that gave substance to the moral and political judgments that post-war German society was obligated to make about its own immediate past. The discovery in 2016 of the cache of Himmler documents in Israel, previously mentioned in this account but deserving of more detailed treatment, is worth examining in some depth because of what it reveals about the ongoing process of archival recovery and about the complex provenance history of Nazi-era documents. The documents were found among the papers of Chaim Nussbaum, a former Israeli military chaplain who had died years earlier, by his grandson, who was sorting through his grandfather's belongings. How Nussbaum had come to possess them remained unclear. He had served with Allied forces during the war and in its immediate aftermath, and the most plausible explanation is that the documents had come into his possession in the chaotic final days of the war or in the period immediately following the German surrender, when enormous quantities of captured German documents were in various hands, and the formal archival collection process had not yet fully taken hold. The documents included personal letters, official correspondence, and what appeared to be draft versions of some of Himmler's speeches. Material that, while not entirely unknown in its content, provided new details and formulations that added to the scholarly record. The question of the legal and institutional status of such documents, whether they should be regarded as the private property of whoever holds them or as historical artifacts belonging, in some sense, to the public record and therefore to appropriate archival institutions, has been raised by this and similar cases. German law is complicated on this point. The Federal Republic does not generally regard captured Nazi documents as state property, in the way that, for example, the original copies of major political documents might be regarded as state property. The result is that significant historical materials can and do end up in private hands, sometimes in the hands of collectors who are motivated by historical interest, sometimes in the hands of individuals with more problematic motivations. The controversy over the sale of Hitler's personal effects, Goering's correspondence, and various other Nazi-era documents at auction has recurred repeatedly in the decades since the war and continues to generate debate about the appropriate balance between private property rights and historical and moral obligations. The study of Himmler's journals has also contributed to one of the most important ongoing debates in Holocaust historiography: the debate between intentionalist and functionalist interpretations of how the Holocaust came about. Intentionalist historians like Lucy Dawidowicz and Daniel Goldhagen have argued that the Holocaust was the result of a long-standing ideological intention on the part of Hitler and the Nazi leadership, a plan that was formulated early and implemented systematically as circumstances allowed. Functionalists, historians like Martin Brossat and Hans Mommsen, have argued that the Holocaust was not the result of a single pre-existing plan, but emerged from a cumulative radicalization process driven by the dynamics of the Nazi system, by competing bureaucracies and local initiatives, and by the particular pressures of the wartime environment. Most contemporary historians have moved toward a synthesis, the so-called moderate intentionalist or emergent genocide position, which acknowledges both the long-standing ideological intention and the importance of the specific historical circumstances of 1941 and 1942 in determining the form that the genocide took. Himmler's journals are central to this debate because they provide the most detailed documentation available of the decision-making process at the heart of the SS, the institution that was, more than any other, responsible for implementing the Holocaust. And what the journals show is consistent with the synthesis position: a man with deep-seated, long-standing ideological convictions about the necessity of eliminating the Jews from Europe who, in the specific circumstances of the war against the Soviet Union in 1941, moved from a policy of expulsion and persecution to a policy of systematic mass murder, making that transition not through a single dramatic decision, but through a series of escalating steps, each of which followed logically from the previous one within the framework of his ideology. The personal library of Heinrich Himmler, the books he owned, annotated, and in some cases read, provides yet another dimension of the documentary record. His reading lists and book annotations, which survive in partial form in archives and have been studied by historians, show the same combination of the systematic and the eccentric that characterized all aspects of his intellectual life. He owned and annotated works of military history, of racial science, of Germanic mythology, of agriculture, of alternative medicine, of medieval history, of archaeology. He was a particular enthusiast for accounts of the Teutonic Knights, the medieval German military religious order that he saw as a historical precedent for the SS, and for various works on the history of witchcraft, in which he was interested not as a believer in literal witchcraft, but as evidence of what he saw as a historical persecution of genuine ancient Germanic wisdom traditions by the Catholic Church. His book annotations are typically spare, underlining occasional marginal comments, but they give a sense of what caught his attention and what he was thinking about in any given period. Alongside the appointment diaries and the personal correspondence, they form part of the composite portrait of a man whose intellectual world was, in its own terms, internally coherent and extensively documented. The role of Himmler's personal faith, or what passed for faith in his particular form of SS mysticism, in sustaining his commitment to the genocidal project is a question that historians have approached from different angles. He had formally left the Catholic Church in 1936, an act that many senior SS officials felt obligated to perform as a demonstration of the organization's break with Christianity. But he did not become an atheist. He became something more like a practitioner of a private religion of his own devising, drawing on Germanic mythology, certain pantheistic ideas drawn from his nature mysticism enthusiasms, and the SS ceremonial life that he had carefully constructed as an alternative to the religious rituals he had abandoned. He believed in fate, in destiny, in the idea that the Germanic race had a cosmic mission that it was the SS's role to fulfill. He believed in reincarnation, or something like it, and in a continuity of the racial essence that transcended individual death. He told Felix Kirsten in one of their recorded conversations that when he died he expected to be reincarnated as a Germanic hero, that his present life was simply one episode in a longer spiritual journey. These convictions did not excuse his crimes, they illuminate the psychological mechanism by which a man of ordinary native capacity could sustain over more than a decade the psychological state required to administer mass murder on an industrial scale. When killing is sanctified by cosmic mission, it becomes not a moral transgression but a duty. The testimony of the survivors of the SS system, the concentration camp survivors, the Einsatzgruppen survivors, the survivors of the ghettos and the deportations, stands as the most powerful counter-document to the cold administrative record of Himmler's journals. Where the appointment diaries record meetings and visits in terse, bureaucratic shorthand, the survivor testimonies recover the human reality that the bureaucratic language was designed to conceal. Primo Levi's accounts of Auschwitz, Elie Wiesel's account of Buchenwald and Auschwitz, the testimonies collected at Nuremberg and in subsequent trials, the oral histories gathered by the USC Shoah Foundation and other institutions. These are the other half of the historical record, the half that Himmler's journals cannot provide because they were written from the perpetrator's perspective and the perpetrator's language could not accommodate the humanity of the victims. The two halves of the record, the administrative documentation and the survivor testimony, need to be read together, each illuminating and contextualizing the other for a complete historical picture to emerge. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which convened in November 1945 and delivered its verdicts in October 1946, used Himmler's documents extensively in prosecuting the surviving Nazi leaders. Himmler himself was beyond prosecution, but his documents helped establish the guilt of Hermann Göring, Alfred Rosenberg, Hans Frank, Wilhelm Frick, and others who had collaborated in and enabled the crimes that the SS carried out. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the only SS officer among the major Nuremberg defendants who had succeeded Heydrich as head of the RSHA, was convicted and executed in October 1946, with Himmler's own documentation among the evidence used against him. In subsequent trials, the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials conducted by American military tribunals from 1946 to 1949, SS officers including the Einsatzgruppen commanders, the concentration camp administrators, and the SS economic officials were prosecuted using documentation from Himmler's administrative empire. The Einsatzgruppen trial of 1947 and 1948, which prosecuted the commanders of the mobile killing units, used the Einsatzgruppen's own operational reports, which had been compiled and reviewed by Himmler's office, as the primary evidence of the defendants' guilt. 22 of the 24 defendants were convicted, 4 were sentenced to death and executed. Justice for the crimes documented in Himmler's journals was, by any honest accounting, incomplete. Of the hundreds of thousands of men who served in the SS and participated in varying degrees in the crimes of the regime, only a fraction were ever prosecuted. Many who had committed serious crimes lived out their lives in West Germany and in Austria and in various other countries, without facing any legal consequences. The West German legal system, in the first years after the war, was deeply reluctant to prosecute former Nazis, and the denazification process carried out by the Allied occupation authorities had, in practice, allowed the majority of lower-ranking perpetrators to resume their lives with minimal penalty. It was only with the establishment of the Ludwigsburg Central Office for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes in 1958, which centralized the investigation and prosecution of Nazi-era offences, that a more systematic effort began. Even then, the results were limited, partly because key witnesses had died, partly because evidence was difficult to obtain, partly because courts set very high evidentiary standards that were difficult to meet decades after the events in question, and partly because the political will to pursue prosecutions was never as strong as the moral obligation demanded. The ongoing significance of Himmler's journals for contemporary Holocaust education is considerable. In an era when Holocaust denial persists in certain political circles, and when the living generation of survivors is rapidly diminishing, the documentary record, the appointment diaries, the personal correspondence, the administrative files of the SS, becomes ever more essential as evidence that the events of the Holocaust actually occurred, as the historical record says they did. Himmler's journals are particularly valuable in this context because they are not the records of the victims or of neutral observers or of Allied prosecutors. They are the records of the perpetrators themselves. They cannot be dismissed as Allied propaganda or as the unreliable recollections of traumatized survivors. They are the working documents of the man who ran the system, written for his own administrative purposes at the time of the events they record, without any apparent awareness that they might one day be read as evidence of anything other than routine administration. Museums and educational institutions around the world have used documents from Himmler's record in their interpretive programs. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, the Holocaust exhibition at the Imperial War Museum in London, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, the Memorial Museum Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland, all have incorporated material from the Himmler documentation in their exhibits and educational programs. The documents are presented carefully with appropriate context as part of a broader effort to help visitors understand not just what happened, but how it happened, through what process of human decision-making and institutional organization the Holocaust was brought into being. The appointment diaries in particular have proven useful as illustrations of the bureaucratic normalization of genocide, the way in which the most extreme acts can be incorporated into the ordinary working routine of an administrator who has ceased to perceive their victims as human beings deserving of moral consideration. The question of how future generations should engage with the historical record of Heinrich Himmler, including his journals, is one that educators, historians, and ethicists continue to debate. There is a tension between the obligation to document and understand the crimes of the Holocaust as thoroughly as possible, and the concern that excessive focus on the perpetrators may inadvertently serve to humanize them in ways that distort the moral picture. Himmler's journals are, in many ways, deeply humanizing documents. They show a man with a rich inner life, complex personal relationships, intellectual enthusiasms, physical vulnerabilities, and emotional needs that are entirely recognizable as human. The risk is that this humanization might tempt some readers toward a form of sympathy or identification that is morally inappropriate. The counter-argument, the one that most historians and educators have accepted, is that the humanization is precisely the point, that understanding the Holocaust requires understanding that it was perpetrated by human beings, not demons, and that the human capacity for atrocity is therefore a universal human problem, not an aberration confined to a particular people or period. Understanding Himmler as a human being is not the same as excusing him. It is the prerequisite for the harder and more important task of understanding how human beings in his position came to do what he did. The archival journey that has brought Himmler's journals to their current state of accessibility is a story of intellectual and institutional commitment that deserves recognition in its own right. The historians and archivists who travelled to Moscow in the early 1990s to examine the recently opened Soviet archives, who spent months working through the appointment diary volumes with paleographers and translators who annotated and contextualized the documents and made them accessible to the broader scholarly community, these men and women performed a service to historical understanding that has no glamour attached to it, but is of genuine and lasting importance. The documentary editors who have prepared critical editions of Himmler's correspondence, the archivists who have preserved and catalogued the fragile original documents, the translators who have made the German language materials accessible to scholars working in other languages, all of these individuals have contributed to the ongoing project of historical accountability that the existence of the journals makes possible. In the end, the journals of Heinrich Himmler are not simply historical documents in the ordinary sense, records of the past that allow us to understand what happened and why. They are, in a deeper sense, a form of evidence about the human condition itself, about the capacity of human beings to commit atrocity within a framework of institutional organization and ideological conviction that makes the atrocity feel, from the inside, not only permissible, but necessary and even righteous. They document, in the most literal and concrete way possible, the answer to the question that haunts every serious engagement with the Holocaust. How was it possible? The answer, in all its terrible complexity and specificity, is written in Himmler's own hand. It is possible because human beings, ordinary, recognizable, complex human beings with families and hobbies and health anxieties and agricultural interests, are capable, when given the right institutional context, the right ideology, and the right historical moment, of systematic atrocity on a scale that staggers comprehension. And it is documented because human beings, other human beings, equally ordinary, equally recognizable, have committed themselves to the patient, unglamorous, morally essential work of preserving and studying those documents and placing them in the historical record where they can serve the purposes of understanding, accountability, and prevention. The ongoing process of historical scholarship on Himmler and the SS, supported by the documentary legacy of his journals, continues to produce new knowledge and new interpretive frameworks. Recent scholarship has increasingly focused on the regional and local dimensions of Holocaust implementation, on the ways in which the orders and directives that emanated from Himmler's office were interpreted, adapted, and sometimes exceeded by local commanders who brought their own initiatives to the process of murder. This scholarship has refined our understanding of the relationship between central direction and local initiative in the implementation of genocide, showing that the process was more complex and more multiply-authored than a simple chain-of-command model would suggest, while also confirming that the central direction provided by Himmler and the institutional framework of the SS was essential to the scale and systematicity of what occurred. We should also note the important scholarly contributions that have been made by historians working in the tradition of perpetrator studies, the investigation of the psychology, ideology, and social world of the men who carried out the Holocaust. Christopher Browning's landmark 1992 study, Ordinary Men, which examined the records of Reserve Police Battalion 101, a unit of middle-aged German policemen who carried out mass shootings of Jews in occupied Poland, raised fundamental questions about the relationship between individual psychology, institutional pressure, and ideological commitment in explaining why ordinary men committed extraordinary crimes. Harold Welser's subsequent work on the social psychology of perpetrators explored similar questions with a different theoretical framework. More recently, Nathan Stoltzfus, Claudia Kuhns, Robert Gellatley, and many others have contributed to a rich scholarly literature on the various dimensions of perpetrator motivation and behavior. Himmler's journals are a central reference point for all of this scholarship, providing the most extensive and detailed documentation available of the inner world and the working life of the man at the top of the perpetrator hierarchy. The lessons that Himmler's journals offer for the present are not comfortable ones, but they are essential. They remind us that genocide is not a natural disaster or an act of God, but a human project, carried out by human beings who made human choices within a particular political, institutional, and ideological context. They remind us that institutions built around exclusionary ideology can normalize atrocity with terrifying speed and thoroughness. They remind us that the combination of bureaucratic, rationality, and ideological fanaticism is one of the most dangerous combinations in human history, capable of channeling the ordinary energies of administration into the service of extraordinary evil. And they remind us that the documentary record, the appointment diaries, the letters, the reports, the orders, is the most powerful antidote we have to the temptation of historical amnesia and denial. As long as these documents exist and are accessible and are studied, the facts of what happened remain available to those who need to know them. That availability is not automatic. It depends on the work of institutions and individuals who choose, consciously and deliberately, to preserve the record and keep it open. In that work, there is something that might, with appropriate caution and without sentimentality, be called hope. The legacy of Heinrich Himmler's journals extends beyond the academic and legal spheres into the realm of cultural memory. Novelists, filmmakers, and dramatists have drawn on the documentary record he left behind to reconstruct the world of the SS in ways that attempt to make its reality comprehensible to general audiences. Jonathan Little's novel The Kindly Ones, published in French in 2006 and subsequently translated into numerous languages, was a controversial attempt to render the inner world of an SS officer in fiction, a project that relied extensively on the historical documentation of the SS apparatus that Himmler's journals helped make available. Films like Conspiracy, the 2001 dramatization of the Wannsee Conference starring Kenneth Branagh as Heydrich, drew directly on the documentary record of that meeting, the Wannsee Protocol, which was itself a product of the administrative machinery that Himmler oversaw. These cultural responses to the historical documentation are themselves part of the ongoing process by which the facts of the Holocaust are absorbed, interpreted, and transmitted across generations. They are imperfect vehicles for historical understanding. Fiction inevitably simplifies and dramatizes in ways that documentary history does not, but they serve an important function in making the history accessible to audiences who might never read a scholarly biography or an archival study. And the quality of those cultural responses depends, in the end, on the quality and accessibility of the underlying historical documentation. Himmler's journals, in this sense, have shaped not only academic history, but the broader cultural memory of the Holocaust. The relationship between memory and documentation in Holocaust historiography is a complex one. Survivor testimony and documentary evidence are not simply two parallel tracks of historical knowledge. They interact, support, challenge, and complicate each other in ways that require careful scholarly navigation. The documentary record can provide dates, numbers, organizational structures, and chains of command with a precision that memory, especially traumatic memory experienced decades earlier, often cannot. But the documentary record, particularly in the case of records like Himmler's appointment diaries, also has profound limitations. It was created by the perpetrators, in the perpetrator's language and categories, for the perpetrator's administrative purposes. It does not record the experience of the victims. It records only the administrative fact of their persecution and murder. The survivor testimonies fill this gap, recovering what the bureaucratic language suppresses: the individual human beings with their names and faces and histories and relationships, who were reduced in the perpetrator's records to numbers and categories. Himmler's journal entry for the day of a mass deportation records the meeting at which the deportation was ordered. The testimony of a survivor records what it was like to be pushed onto the cattle car. Both are essential, neither is sufficient alone. The historical truth of the Holocaust requires both the perpetrator documentation and the victim testimony, read together, each illuminating what the other cannot capture. One final dimension of Himmler's documentary legacy deserves mention: the question of what the journals reveal about the men and women who served directly under him in the senior SS leadership. His appointment diaries record dozens of names of officers, officials, and administrators who appear regularly in his schedule, who attended his meetings, who received his orders and transmitted them down the chain of command. These names are, in many cases, well known to Holocaust scholars: Reinhard Heydrich, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Oswald Pohl, Friedrich Wilhelm Krüger, Odilo Globokschnik, Rudolf Höss, Adolf Eichmann, Walter Schellenberg, Karl Wolff, Kurt Daluege. But they also include hundreds of lesser-known figures: regional SS and police commanders, concentration camp administrative staff, racial resettlement officials, Einsatzgruppen. Officers whose presence in Himmler's appointment books places them at the center of the decision-making and implementing machinery of the Holocaust in ways that have significant implications for the historical record of individual responsibility. For scholars working on the specific histories of particular operations or particular regions, the ability to place a named individual in a meeting with Himmler on a particular date is often the critical link that establishes their knowledge of and participation in criminal orders. In this sense, Himmler's appointment diaries function as a kind of master key to individual accountability within the SS system. A document that connects the Supreme Command Authority with the thousands of named individuals who translated that authority into the reality of mass murder. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this deep exploration of Heinrich Himmler's wartime journals informative, thought-provoking, and historically illuminating. If you enjoyed learning about today's topic, make sure to check out our other videos exploring the inner worlds of the Nazi leadership, the machinery of the Holocaust, and the untold stories of World War II. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest content. See you in the next one!